Okay, so let's get started again. So week 10, just a quick highlight about what's on this week, what's happening, and looking forward to the last 3 weeks. So what you need to be thinking about. So I'm going to just in the tutorial today talk again about what the expectations of the implementation phase, as we said last week. Week 9 we were sort of transitioning between ideation and implementation. So just making sure that you're on board with those expectations, trying to finalise your social business model today. Then I hope in the tutorial to spend quite a bit of time with each group, just making sure everything's in shape. If you remember week 11, which is next week, there's a chance for you, we'll spend most of the tutorial making sure that the week 12 presentation and the 12 report is going to measure up. So that's a chance to talk about those requirements next week. But I just want to kind of a heads up on that today, get that discussion started. Spend 10 or 15 minutes today. I just want to make sure that the student course assessment, I think, which is now available, that you complete. Reason for that is usually every semester I get a small percentage. I'd like to increase that. So anyway, we'll get you to do that today. The final report requirements and progress. So I want to discuss that as well with everybody and then individually. What should that look like? Now, although that's spelled out under assessments, spelled out what the expectation is, I just want to go over that again and talk with you specifically about how you think you're going to do that and how you are doing that and what you might show me next week. So quite a lot of talk about those sorts of things. And then just a few other typical things. So, more specifically today, future of design thinking. Let's hope this all works. No. So, indeed. Future of design thinking, yes. So you've spent a semester looking at what this is, what design thinking is, where it's sort of come from, how it's being applied, what some of the challenges are, at least that people put forward as challenges, and then applying it in your specific case to, the project that you've worked on. So, so the value of that, and I've suggested to you the value of doing that, and the value in a sense of taking this course is to be part of a general movement, a global movement. I think it's true to say that keeps suggesting that design thinking is a valuable skill to have. So in addition to being able to design, whatever you happen to be doing, multimedia, interior, architecture, whatever that happens to be, in addition to being able to do that, the ability to think through a problem, often a wicked problem, with other people and with the stakeholders, and to apply designerly-like ways of working is a good thing. Is a thing that business management, social innovation, public health, all sorts of fields think might be a good contribution to developing innovation. So if you think about it in those sort of terms. So a way of coming up with innovations in other fields, for other areas. So that would suggest given that's quite actual, that's quite something that's very current, that would suggest it's a good thing to know, and that it might even be useful job-wise. And I've said to you, from a career point of view, certainly I can think of half a dozen off the top of my head, half a dozen students who've either done PhDs with me or masters, or who've gone on from having left Swinburne and having taken design thinking, who now work to some extent or other in that area, inside companies or in their agencies and things like that. So I think from my own personal experience, I think it is a good thing. I think there's definitely a global move to keep expanding design thinking, so it's a good thing to know. But other people are asking questions also about this, whether that's in fact the case and what is going on. So there is the, if you like, there's the design thinking is dead movement. I don't know what we compare that to, but anyway. The design thinking is dead movement, saying that design thinking was an interesting phase, that we've moved on, and that therefore turning up to a job interview saying you have these skills would be like shooting yourself in the foot. So that discourse exists, and so what do they mean by that? Is that a relevant approach? What is the consequence of design thinking being applied to lots of other areas? Because that's really where its strength has been, in its use in spaces of social innovation or social enterprise or public health or these other areas, education. If that's still happening, which it is globally, if that's still happening, there's lots of enthusiasm. How does that balance up then with this other group of people saying it's dead? How can the two kind of coexist? And therefore asking, what next, where to from here, and the sort of promises and challenges. So there is this kind of confusing discussion out there, but on the one hand you'll read, don't bother with this, this was a fad, we've got over it, and the other, let's do this, this is great, and it makes a huge impact. But how do those things measure up? And what people like Tim Brown and IDEO and Jocelyn Wyatt and people like that who work in that area, what they think about that is important, in the sense that they continue to lead a lot of this discussion and practice. And so hearing what Tim has to say, and what has been achieved with design thinking, what still needs to happen, and what are the challenges, is a relevant conversation. Let's see if we can get Tim's Vimeo. Yeah. Let's see if we can get this going. Stay hopeful, stay hopeful. Alright. Very slow. It must be doing some design thinking, I think. Look at that. Ah, right. Okay. Oh, yes, yes. This is like me getting out of bed this morning. Come on, come on. Oh. All right. Not the last time I did it. You didn't have to. So I'll subscribe to Vimeo. All right. Anyway. Yeah, it's very strange. The rules changed. I hope the other one works. Anyway, better than that. Let me summarise. I'm not sure that you have to be subscribed. There must be some workaround, but let's not do that right now. So, one of the things, it's true, as IDEO moved, and IDEO has been one of the great examples. IDEO was and Tim Brown and other people at the company were some of the first to talk about David Kelly and so on and so forth. We're the first to talk about the significance of this design thinking movement and to make it happen. And so what happened with the company in particular was, IDEO, a great product innovation company who kind of moved to service and product innovation. They started getting asked to do increasingly more broader projects. So better education system in Peru, or even helping NFL players transition to life after football, for example. So the projects got a little more complex than just product design and product innovation, and they moved with it. And hence, now, as you know from the Design Kit site, you have a company, an organisation that is highly involved with developing social innovation through design thinking. So that's been achieved. One of Tim Brown's claims or comments, one that I find still really useful, as other people have talked about design thinking, is that he says that the design thinking movement, if you like, is just a starter for a conversation. What he means by that is it's not the new solution to everything, the new solution to solving all wicked problems in all contexts and everything else, but the start of a conversation about how creative methods can be brought to other areas and create good solutions. And I think his kind of, I call it humble if you like, statement is quite an interesting one. So he's not saying we have invented, the method to solve the world's problems. You just need to implement it. But rather that it's a good start, as I say, good start to a conversation about that. So that leads to challenges and opportunities for the future, for not just for IDEO but in general, about how to do that. And I think one of the key things which you may have learned also or remember from the semester is that in moving into medicine, health and other areas, inevitably design meets other kinds of ways of working. It meets medicine's, let's say, medical science type of discourses and practices. It meets education, theory and method, and so on and so forth. And so in that encounter, if you like, is the potential for success and failure. Success if design manages to talk properly to these other fields. Failure if it doesn't. If it doesn't listen, if it just comes with the creative idea, that won't do. It'll have to be a real conversation about the co-contribution. So another piece of thinking about this promise of design thinking in a paper by Lindbergh and friends is this idea that, it's kind of here in the title, sounds fancy, metadisciplinary creative collaboration. Basically what they mean is that if design is successful in working with all of these other different fields, and helps to create good solutions, then maybe this approach has some sort of broad, hence meta, has some sort of broad value. So broad, that is value for management, value for health, value for engineering, value for everything. Hence meta-disciplinary. It's kind of above the, the disciplinary differences. So that whole issue of working with these different disciplines, the positive promise is that it creates a way of working in all sorts of fields. So there's the possibility, and some people, strongly believe in that. The other thing that sort of is playing out in this work of design thinking in different areas is the fact that inevitably when people talk about it or say we're doing design thinking, they often mean different things by it. And what they mean is sometimes more or less superficial. So Lucy Kimball, who's worked for a number of organisations, the Young Foundation, for example, in the UK. She's at University of London at the moment. She used to work for the Oxford Side Business School. And Lucy has done some thinking about some of these things as well. And one of the things that she says, in one of her interesting papers is that she says the design thinking notion separates thinking and doing in a way that is not necessarily helpful. So we have this kind of design thinking as this sort of theory thing, and then there's design doing, and that these two are sort of separate things. So rather than that idea, we take on this notion that design thinking is always embodied work, meaning it only makes sense when you're doing it, and it only has meaning in a particular context that you do it. So there isn't this separation between some sort of theory, thinking, and doing. There's only a practice which has principles. So let's not keep it separate in that sense of embodied. So the second thing that she raises, which is worth thinking about and relevant to the future of design thinking, is this idea that there should be, or there is, a unified design thinking idea, or theory or method, some sort of formula that applies across all the different practices and places where it's working. So one could ask the question, is that useful? Is that meaningful? Should it be important? And many of us, if we go back a little to that idea that I introduced some time ago, Roger Martin, where he talks about mystery, heuristic, and algorithm. If we think about design thinking at the heuristic level, in the middle of that sort of funnel, as an approach that is about having principles or rules of thumb to figure stuff out, but it's not a rule book, then if it stays at that sort of flexible level of not a rule book, then it can be applied to all sorts of different situations, and there will be no conflict because it's not a rule book, it's just a set of principles. that get meaning when you go into a specific place. So no conflict there. And so this idea of a unified design thinking idea, I mean, I slightly disagree with Lucy and some other people that that's not the case. I think that there is commonality across these different applications. It's just how you view this. If it's principles, there's no conflict. It's a bit like wicked problem solving, you know. Some of you who read that, we talked about it last week, 10 characteristics of wicked problems. They get real, they get specific meaning in a specific context. But if we stay at that level of principle, we don't have a conflict. So yeah, she also talks here about descriptions of design thinking rest sometimes on contradictory views about the nature of design and for claims about being user-centered and stuff. So emphasise the designer as the main agent within design. So we know that what's happened here, we know that what has happened with the spread of design thinking into management schools and into hospitals and into schools of medicine, for example, Monash Med Centre or whatever. We know that what that has done has decentered the designer. The designer is not the leader of many of these projects. These projects are led by people from those disciplines who have some capacity to work in those contexts. So, so this talk about user-centered, and interestingly enough, people still do talk about design thinking in relation to user-centeredness, but I have said to you, actually human-centeredness is a better term. And there's a good reason for that. And there I agree with Tim Brown that human-centeredness is a far better term than user-centered because this goes back to usability studies, a focus on the individual who we're designing for, but not the broader stakeholders of the system or environment in which we're working. Human-centeredness does do that. And human-centeredness as a phrase or as a designation is far more powerful because it connects with a lot of the work, global work, if you like, you know, going back to the Sustainable Development Goals, global issues about equity and balance and things like that. So when we talk about, for example, Amartya Sen's, I mentioned before, development is freedom, human-centeredness has been a mainstream idea in development circles since the 1990s, not user-centeredness. Because human-centered talks about humans and communities. User-centered just, again, has this idea of, you know, me and the new thing we're making and whether it's usable and functional. So, so I think we need to step away from user-centered, and some of us already have. You read, I know some of you read about from Lars Gröger and Serbel and the others about Australia, barriers and opportunities. And one of the things that is mentioned there is this notion that it's kind of building on that idea that design thinking doesn't have a single meaning, and therefore it's kind of ambiguous and sloppy, and you know, we're over this. they point out in that, they talk about in that article, particularly in the context of business and management, that you have ideas out there about design thinking as a mindset. One of my former PhD students, who's now with some finance company, I've forgotten the name. Anyway, she and I and some others wrote an article for the Journal of Business and Innovation about design thinking and mindset, and whether that was a good idea. It's sometimes design thinking is connected with service, making service happen. We've talked about the overlaps between those two. Design doing, the actual act of designing. Design thinking as a tool. And then design thinking as a covert tool. So kind of slipping it in so that people don't notice that the black turtlenecks have taken over. So, being discreet. So, these different definitions mean that, one, there's no consistency perhaps, and two, when you come into business, you have to get them to think about design for strategy. So this whole, idea about ambiguous definitions. Now, my key insight from this, especially in terms of the business and management community, is the problem there with business and management is that every 6 months there's a new way of talking about doing innovation. So business moves from model to model. 5 years ago it was Six Sigma, then design thinking kind of became the flavour of the month, and then we've got creative minds and all sorts of things. So business and management is very adept at picking up new terms and saying this is how we do it now. So my tip is that this idea that design thinking is dead or confused or weak, a lot of it comes from business and management, and they get tired very easily of new ideas and they grasp a new one. And very much in business and management, design thinking is a tool. Like when I'm fixing my bicycle. It's not a set of principles per se. It's a new tool I can bring in at a certain point in my business idea to get something done, as opposed to a creative kind of mindset. A mindset that says we need to be open, flexible, we need to have a bunch of options on the table at any one point, and we need to not invest too much in any one of them until we've done some work and out of it emerges which is the best option. That approach, that sort of broader strategic approach, does exist, but in business and management, because business cycles are very short and people want profit in the next 6 months, taking a flexible approach is either frightening or impossible in a big organisation. So there's this question about too many meanings. Is that the issue? Is that the weakness here? And so people like Schulberg and so in this paper, Design Thinking, Past, Present and Possible Futures, talks about 5 different kind of meanings for design thinking which are out there, taking that sort of approach. Again, I think possibly what's happening there, again, is a bit of confusion. Every time you take a set of principles and you apply it to a specific context, you will get different meanings. Hence, you will find different meanings. Because it's a little bit like having a set of elements in your fridge, and then specific recipes out of those elements that you can make. Those specific recipes will be different, but you might always be using, six ingredients. Sorry, I keep saying elements. I have cooked recently. So I've got some chicken and some, curry, certain paste, and some cashews and coconut cream and something else. There's a lot I can do with that. And each time I put those together, I'm going to get a distinct sort of recipe. And if I look at those and the way they look and possibly the way they taste, depending also on whether I put in garlic salt or not, and or coriander and things like that, I can sort of change it around a little bit. I'm going to get different meanings. My thought is that, on the one hand, as an analogy, design thinking properly understood as a series of principles is more like the ingredients that we have and are available to make 5 or 10 different specific dishes. So there are, there are different fears ahead. This idea that design thinking won't make it, business will, reject it, and this is also true for corporate America. So that those fears exist. Paul Pangro. Now let's wait and see if we also need to subscribe to this one. We didn't last one. Anyway, Paul Pangro, who does cybernetics, has said some interesting things. Let's see if we can hear what he says. Otherwise, I will summarise. Right. Oh, look at that. We don't need to subscribe.
Design thinking was a term that arose in order to distinguish between what others think of as design, which is usually just the surface, to the thinking behind. Thinking is something you do first, and then you make, at least in the traditional view. So I think design thinking arose in order to communicate something new about design, that is not just surface, but it's about a process that informs all of the actions of creating something. And of course, those actions start with thinking about what needs to be created. So I understand very well why the term design thinking arose, but I have problems with the term design thinking. First of all, if you're only thinking, then you're not doing, and you have to do in order to know, and you have to know in order to think better. So that's really a loop, and design thinking tends to isolate it as if it can be isolated. That's impossible. You cannot isolate thinking from doing. It's a myth. So that's one issue with design thinking. But also the processes of design thinking, I find, are a kind of grab bag, sort of odds and ends. Certainly an improvement over analytical thinking, which is what came before, particularly when you apply design to business. There's analytical thinking, and there's numbers, and there's quantification. All good, all fine in a business setting, but design thinking named a transition where we want now to bring the creative side in, and the human-centered rather than the business-centered, or the number-centered, or the analytically centered side. So design thinking as a transition, I think, is a great thing, and it's been useful, but it's only a waypoint. If we stop at design thinking, I think we won't solve the problems that those in design thinking say they want to solve, because it's not a discipline, because it's not a methodology. It's a couple of ways of behaving, but those ways of behaving are vague. They're not really convergent. I don't know what I'm measuring when I'm iterating. It's all a bit too vague for me. And I think if we invest too much in design thinking, then it'll crash, as some think it's beginning to. But also, we won't know where to go from it. I think it's time now to pick it up and to say, what is it about design thinking that was better? And then how do we move to the next phase, make it more quantitative, make it more reliable, and make it more robust as an entire process rather than just a couple of different things that happen to be pulled together. I don't want to lose the creativity, and I don't want to lose the ability to innovate, but I claim that pure design thinking does not of itself lead to innovation.
So,
the most important thing, I would say, to anyone in design thinking, as I would say in any field of practice, is to know the limits. If you don't know the limitations of what you're doing or what you're designing for, then you don't know enough. You don't know enough to claim this is a good design. You have to know what it isn't a good design for to know the limits. You have to know the boundary in order to know the quality of it, obviously. And the limitations of design thinking are vast. It's the reason why it's being questioned so much. So it had this wonderful curve up, it crossed the chasm. Everyone, for some time now, has been talking about design thinking. The danger is, and this is already predicted, I'm not the first to say this, that design thinking will crash because too much of it is expected of it. So what I would like to do is move ahead and say, what are its limitations? What are the boundaries of it? What can't it do? And what can we do differently to then transition to a new thing?
Thank you, Paul. All right. So some very good thoughts there and very good observation. And I think what Paul was reacting to, in particular in terms
My name's
of...
Paul Pangaro.
Oh.
I like to think of myself as a designer of ideas.
Good.
I did.
Yeah. Yes. So, oh, we went back to the start. So, right. Anyway, so Paul's thing is that, and I think it's based very much on what was out there, that design thinking got sort of brought out and taught in little workshops and books and things like that as an isolated thing. And of course it had limits. Interestingly enough, the design kit, the manual that you now use, that I suggested to you, the field guide, as I think I mentioned before, it now includes business modeling as a key tool. 5 years ago that wasn't the case. When you did an IDEO course on design thinking, there was no business modeling. There was no contextualization in the broader sense of the culture or the society that you were working in. There was no suggestion that this needed to match up with the requirements of, say, a social enterprise or the needs of culture. The paper that you read from a colleague of mine in India about slum redevelopment, where they compared two approaches and tested that, is actually answering Paul's question about design thinking needing to be measured. The outcomes are actually measured, not just everybody clapping and going, wow, doesn't that look great. Social impact. So the need for measures, the need to actually not just say, this is great because it looks great, because it's designerly, but rather to say, this is great because it actually achieves a better solution than we could have done this way, and here's the evidence. Here's the impact measurement. Here are people saying, here's the quantitative and qualitative measures of social impact that tell us that this is valuable. If you don't do that, you will disappear in 6 months, because then you're just another exciting, temporarily exciting workshop. So I think Paul Pangaro's comments are relevant to a lot of what's out there, but many of us are still trying to see the value, packaging design thinking together with other important measures and mechanisms to make it more robust. And yes, I agree, I think in 5 years' time, if we're lucky, if we're fortunate, elements of creative problem solving will not be called design thinking because they'll be mainstreamed, but they will be packaged together with approaches to social impact measurement, to social innovation, to emergent problem solving and things like that. So I think that's part of where things are going at the moment. So in answering, and I'm thinking ahead to what you might say in your post this week, where to next for design thinking. So there are predictions, it'll disappear, it's vague, we're past that. I think some of those criticisms are relevant and accurate in some circles, but not in all. In 5 to 10 years, I think the success of any innovation is whether it can be mainstreamed. If it's not mainstreamed, if it doesn't become the norm, that's a measure of its success. So if the ways of doing design thinking become mainstream, then that's a measure of its success. The name may disappear, but the practices will remain. What are the bigger issues and concepts? Clearly, the bigger issues in some sense are those wicked problems that you've read about, whether they're climate change or the consequences of climate change or the consequences of the rise of conservative right-wing governments and things like that. How do we solve those issues? They are big issues. Can creativity contribute? I think there is value in thinking about that and value in testing that. So all of that is relevant, and all of that relevant also, and we'll talk about this today in the tutorial, to that first part of your report where you have to talk about design thinking. Beginning that report, introducing your report with something like a summary about the strengths and weaknesses of design thinking, of its future or its lack of a future, will be quite a good way to do that. And to draw a conclusion based on the evidence of having tried yourself in this semester with other people to solve some problem through using that approach is a good way also of backing up what you're saying. So backing it up with your experience, but backing it up also with what you've read and we've discussed. Those two sources, in a general sense, experience and reading, will provide the best way for writing that first part. So, we are done. Which? Yeah, anything.
Okay, so just like a PDF that we can
Something. It's really, as opposed to actually doing it, it's more like showing what you've done.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Yep. No. Yep. So we'll talk about what you learned from the prototyping. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the next week, whatever you're going to...
So next week will be really sort of wrapping up lots of, obviously looking more closely at report fine presentation and any questions that you have on implementation. Yeah. So next week's really kind of a total wrap up.
Oh,
4 weeks.
Ah, it's okay. We already started.
Good.
I think by that time we're going to have like this draft of the final.
Okay, and that also, yeah.
So if
We can talk about that next week.
okay,
You know the.
yeah. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
Se comprende. Oh, sorry. No.
It's good that you speak something
Monday's
like that.
really getting to me.
Eh? Monday? Oh, I see, right, okay.
I was thinking about
Yeah,
language
yeah.
and I was like,
Real
I don't
confusion.
understand this. What's that?
It's to make you awake today.
Yes, sir, I was just testing.